Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm just waiting a couple of minutes until everybody has joined. And then, as always, some people join a bit later, and that's also fine. Very happy to be here today with Julie Holland, a personal role model and inspiration in this field. I actually remember reading your book Ecstasy: The Complete Guide. I think it was the first book that I read on psychedelics, and it was really inspiring to me. So
Thank you.
happy to be here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being included. I'm really looking forward to coming to Sweden and meeting everybody from that part of the globe.
And before we begin, I want to just acknowledge that the connection is a little bit choppy. Um, we will see how it goes, and most importantly, the audio is working.
Yeah, hopefully as long as you guys can hear me, you don't need to see me. I'll move very slowly. Like,
So the agenda for today is basically that Julie and I are going to be having a conversation for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we will start the Q&A, and that's when I'm really hoping for a lot of questions from you guys. And with this webinar format, you can write your questions in the chat, or actually in the questions and answers section. You're very welcome to write questions during the chat, during the conversation, and I will pick them up during the Q&A. However, it's also possible to ask questions live using your voice, and I really want to encourage that because it's just more fun to have a bit of a dialogue and hear more voices during the Q&A.
definitely.
So let's get into it. Julie,
Okay.
first I want to, before getting into the questions, I'm really curious to hear how you're doing right now, where you are right now, both physically, but also like in general in life. What's inspiring you right now?
Hmm. Feel like I'm talking to my therapist now. Like we're dropping into how you're feeling now. Um, I've been very focused on patient care and being a doctor and being a psychiatrist most recently, and also just focusing on my family. It's summer and, we're having some vacation time and things like that. So, just very focused on what's happening in psychiatry. There's a lot of exciting changes in my field, and we've got sort of new tools to start to play with. So I'm doing a lot of education and really I've always been very focused on harm reduction since I first learned about harm reduction in the 80s. So 40 years now, I've been sort of practicing with a harm reduction framework. Just, this idea that people are going to alter themselves, people are going to do risky things, and it's my job as a physician to make sure that they're doing it in the least risky way. And for me to spend my time saying, don't do that, doesn't really help anybody. And so my approach is if you are going to do that, let's figure out how you can do it in the safest way possible. So that's, it's how I raise my kids. It's how I practice in my marriage and a dyad. It's all kind of harm reduction framework. So that's been working for me for a long time. And the thing that's energizing me recently, actually, I just got back from Portugal from the Boom festival, and I got to tour the drug testing sort of facilities from Cosmic Care, and I got to tour the sort of psychedelic first aid clinic, the psychiatric emergency space that is also run by Cosmic Care at Boom, and I was really impressed by their professionalism and what they were doing and how well received they were and how it's just like a huge harm reduction organization that seems to be doing good. And a lot of people were having a lot of fun. at the festival, and it was great to see that. Kind of aging out of that scene, you know. So I was glad to do something like that while I still can.
And I hear that you also played.
Yeah, so this is funny. So the people at Boom, there was the liminal tent sort of at Boom, got in touch with me and they wanted me to give a talk, like give a keynote, you know, give a speech. And I was like, great, here are all the things I can talk about. They said, that sounds great. And then my partner, Jeremy, my husband, said, like, well, why don't you tell them about this thing that you and I do? And I was like, all right. So we got in a call with the Boom people and we told them about what we do, which is this musical couples therapy show that we put on where we play a song, we both sing and play guitar, we sing in harmony, Jeremy writes music, they're beautiful songs, and then in between the songs, we talk about what it really takes to keep a partnership going. We've been together for 30 years and you know, we've been through all the things that happen over decades. And you know sort of what we've figured out, what we've learned from other couples therapists, things like that. So that's turned into like this whole sort of gig. So Boom got back in touch with me and they were like, you know, Julie, as much as we love you, we're more interested in the couples musical therapy thing and we don't want you to give a talk anymore. So I was like, all right, fine, whatever, we're still going to Portugal. And we had a great gig. It was really well received, and you know, I learned a lot just being in that space. I haven't been to a big concert festival like that in a very long time. And it was fun.
And I'm happy to hear that you're still passionate about harm reduction. I've
Yeah.
volunteered with the Zendo project at
Mm-hmm.
Burning Man and found that really inspiring, not just as a way to reduce harm, but also as sort of an inspiration for um, how for psychiatry in the future. I remember being there and just thinking, wow, I wish emergency wards could be a little bit more like this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly having been in Zendo-like situations and having worked at the Bellevue Psychiatric Emergency Room, I agree that it would be great if we could adopt more of the things, you know, that you see in Zendo. Um, and there have been situations where I was at Bellevue, and one of the things I wrote about, I wrote a memoir of my time at Bellevue because I spent 9 years working at this psychiatric emergency room on the weekends, Saturday night, Sunday night. So I wrote a book called Weekends at Bellevue, and one of the chapters is sort of about this issue that you know we once had somebody come in who was high in MDMA, and it really allowed me for the first time to actually like have some psychotherapy with a patient who usually just comes in really agitated and only needs to be sedated. So it was one of the few times that there was any sort of real crossover. Um, but in general, I think hospitals don't really adopt as much, you know, harm reduction sort of philosophy as other people might. Um, yeah, I've been really interested in not just harm reduction. I mean, specifically the parts of harm reduction that I like sort of sing to me is education, and then also this issue of drug testing. You know, we counterfeit drugs and drug substitution. Um, you know, one of the reasons I think why I got interested to start with is that when I was a teenager, I was very interested in drugs and the brain, and I was interested in psychology and psychiatry, and I was reading a lot, and I read about you know, Aldous Huxley's experience with mescaline, and I really wanted to try mescaline, and in an effort to try mescaline, I inadvertently ended up trying PCP. And PCP and mescaline are, you know, qualitatively different experiences. And I had a, you know, a fairly frightening experience where I had a lot of sort of classic psychotic symptoms that happen when you take high dose PCP. And after that whole experience, I was interested in two things. One was I became very interested in psychosis and psychotic thought processes and what schizophrenia looks like and what bipolar mania psychosis looks like and all these things. And that PCP trip really got me interested in psychiatry, honestly. But also over time, it really got me interested in harm reduction because you know, if I wanted to try mescaline, why did I end up with PCP? That's not right. You know, I should have been able, if I want to try mescaline, I should be able to try mescaline. And it's very dangerous if you want one drug and get another. And now in America, what we have is a really dangerous situation where our basically our street drug supply is poisoned. And, for the first time in my lifetime, it used to be this thing they would say, and it was so silly, but they'd be like, oh, if you're taking a drug, it's like playing Russian roulette. And, one drug could, one pill could kill you. And it's like, usually that's really not true. It's usually that's hyperbole and that's an exaggeration. But now, one pill really can kill you. And if buy the wrong, you think it's Xanax or Adderall or whatever it is you think it is, and it's fentanyl, you can die. So the stakes are so much higher now with harm reduction and drug substitution than they ever used to be. I mean, with ecstasy, MDMA, in like the late 90s, early 2000s, there was once people heard about ecstasy, everybody was trying to sort of make it or sell it or, sell whatever they could and say it was ecstasy. And things got bad and a little dangerous, but not like death all the time dangerous. So things are dire here, I feel like. And I don't think you have the same problem as much in Europe where your whole drug supply is poisoned with fentanyl. I certainly hope you don't.
I don't think so. I hope not. And there's with in Europe there are uh, drug testing facilities, like you can send your ecstasy pills to Spain, for example, to an actual
Yeah.
lab and have it professionally tested. Um, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you got into psychedelic research and psychedelic. Uh,
So that PCP experience certainly, I mean, in some ways I was doing psychedelic research. It's just there was no placebo, it was just me. But I think I mean, I joke that I was sort of a born psychedelic researcher. I mean, from a very early age, I would try drugs and write down everything, what time I took it and what time things happened and what my pupils looked like and I was just fascinated. And I know it was only an N of one, but I did, like the first time I ever took MDMA in 1985, I took it alone by myself and I just wrote down like 30 pages of things that I was noticing and thinking. And, it's just sort of the way I've always been with these things. And I was a pre-med the first time I took MDMA, and I was pretty sure, I mean, I knew I was going to medical school. I was sure I was going to be a doctor. I didn't know if it would be like psychiatry or neurology or neurosurgery, but I knew it was like a doctor from here up. And it was just sort of a question of working out which. But when I was studying to be a doctor before I went to med school, that's when I learned about MDMA. And that really got me, it was sort of like the carrot on the stick or like the lure to get me through all the hardships of, med school. Because it's just one hoop to jump through after another after another. And if you don't have some prize at the end, I think it makes it really demoralizing. And so I knew I was going to be a doctor and go to medical school, but there was something about really thinking that I was probably going to be, championing MDMA assisted therapy or working with MDMA. Like that kind of gave me the push to keep going and go through medical school. Um, and, even when I was looking for my psychiatry residency programs, everywhere I interviewed, I talked with them about MDMA and MDMA research and do you think it could happen here? And the guy at Mount Sinai was like, there's no way it's ever going to happen here. Meanwhile, 30 years later, they've got a huge center, psychedelic center, and they're doing like cutting edge MDMA research. And, sometimes I think that if I was maybe a little calmer, or if I was a man, or if things were different 30 years ago, it would have happened earlier, and I came in kind of hot and strong and I had very big ideas about how things should be, and it was just like, that's not going to happen here. You don't talk about that anymore. um so that's one of the reasons I published that MDMA book, Ecstasy: The Complete Guide, is because it's like other people needed to be able to reference something to get the ball rolling, you know? Um, there wasn't a lot of published material. And so if I could put all the published material in one place, then it was just sort of easier for, to get things moving. And that was my first book. And it was a nonprofit book. All the proceeds fund clinical MDMA research. And then later I did a book on cannabis called The Pot Book, and it's the same thing. All the proceeds fund clinical cannabis research. So for this group MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Study, I was the medical monitor for their early MDMA post-traumatic stress disorder studies, and also their later cannabis PTSD studies. Um, and, the MDMA PTSD studies, phase one, phase two, like very encouraging, impressive data. It was clear that we should go on to phase three. The cannabis PTSD study was fraught because we couldn't get good pot from the government, basically. Don't if you're in the United States and you're looking to buy some cannabis, I think anywhere that you buy, except for from the government, you'll probably be perfectly happy with what you bought. But we had real problems with what we started to refer to as the study drug. Nobody really wanted to call it cannabis. So it's hard to prove something works if you're given a really sort of suboptimal compound to work with, and that was very frustrating. Um, so yeah, so I was a medical monitor for MAPS for quite a bit. And then once it got into the phase three, the very rigorous FDA submission timeline with Lycos, then I moved from being a medical monitor to being a medical advisor. And then when Lycos and MAPS split up, which was kind of like mommy and daddy getting a divorce, and I literally emailed one woman and one man from Lycos and Maps, and I was like, who gets Julie? Like, who do I go to? Who should I live with? And what we all really decided was that I should go where I started, which was with Maps. I started with Maps. I didn't start with Lycos. I'm back to just being a medical advisor to Maps. But also things with Lycos are changing, and some of the people who are out are back in, and there's a lot of moving parts now. I mean, I'm happy to talk more about the whole FDA process. I mean, there's a lot going on here. It's not it ain't over till it's over, first of all. It's not over till the fat lady sings, is what they say. So there's still things that can happen that can change what happened last summer, or make it a little bit of a softer no, or a yes and instead of a no. So that's all in the works. But worst
Mm.
case scenario, it's going to take like another 3 years and millions more dollars to get FDA approval for MDMA. And in the meantime, I think the some of the psilocybin companies are going to present to FDA, and we'll see how they do. And they may fare a lot better because they don't have this psychotherapy issue that is really, I mean, there's obviously several issues that are very important that sort of present roadblocks to FDA approval. The psychotherapy component is one of those.
Yeah, I'd really like to get more into details on the FDA process and decision. Um, but at first, I'd like to hear a little bit more about maps and Lycos. Like why was Lycos formed? Uh,
Yeah, so I mean it's first of all, MAPS started out as, not a pharmaceutical company, but just like a group, a consortium of people who wanted to promote psychedelic research. And then over time, MAPS sort of grew into we're going to try to get MDMA FDA approved. And once that started happening, MAPS spun off something called a PBC, which is a public benefit corporation. So the idea is that MAPS is going to be a pharmaceutical company, but they're not going to be for profit. They're going to put all the money back in to MAPS, the fundraising entity that's trying to do harm reduction and drug policy reform and things like that. So for a while, MAPS was running fairly successfully. Everything, all the trials and everything that has to happen for a drug to be FDA approved. But it did get to a point where they needed more money and, longer runway. And as much as private funding was coming in, people were sort of, I would say that the people who were funding were tired of it just being a charitable contribution, and they really wanted it to have some sort of return on their investment. And as soon as people started talking about investment instead of charity, things fell apart. And Lycos, is not a nonprofit, and there is a profit involved, and it may be it may still be officially a public benefit corporation. I'm not even really sure, but it just became clear that the money part of it was changing. The science isn't changing. The idea and the belief that MDMA could be useful to people as a catalyst for therapy, like all the belief and everything, the data, that didn't change, but the money and who was paying and what they expected back, that all changed. But now it's changing again, and that what's happening now is that there's potentially sort of a rescue happening where a bunch of money is going to come into Lycos, and because MAPS brought that money in, it may turn out to be reformulated differently. I mean, I would say stay tuned. It is definitely a work in progress. Things are fluid. And also, our whole government is a work in progress and fluid, and things are really changing at all levels of the government for most, I was going to say for bad and good. It's really for mostly bad. And if there's any silver lining to like the dumpster fire that is happening in America, the silver lining is that psychedelics and MDMA and cannabis remain bipartisan issues where people on both sides, of the political spectrum agree about a lot of these things. They agree that they want the veterans to have access to psychedelics if it will help them with their trauma, if it will help them with their brain injuries. So I think it's these sorts of things potentially unite us. This idea of like libertarianism that we can have cognitive liberty and we're allowed to ingest what we want and have our own thoughts and nobody can control that. That is a bipartisan issue. So, it maybe with this sort of very unconventional new health secretary and people in the upper echelons of who decides what's healthy in America, which is just crazy right now, but maybe the silver lining is that things will move forward a little bit with psychedelics. But honestly, I would rather just have our sane government back and be a little bit more patient with psychedelics getting confirmed. I like it's, too high a price to pay. It's like the risk benefit analysis still is better that, we have functioning government and are a little bit more patient with getting these things approved. But I think they will eventually get approved because they work, and if they're done in a group setting, they really are sort of, the cost benefit analysis works out in favor of them. So, they're relatively safe medicines. Physiologically, they're very safe. Psychologically, you can have behavioral things that are unsafe, which is why, of course, we need all the supervision, education, and integration afterwards. All that stuff is important because it really is, that's where the harm reduction comes in, is preparing somebody and working with them afterwards also.
Yeah, so there's the big like dilemma is commercialization and
Yeah.
how interacting with the psychedelic movement and the scientific process.
Yeah, there's a lot of intersections there, especially, I would say that the sort of true believers in the psychedelic space aren't necessarily capitalists. Or scientists. And so you're working, you're taking something that is sort of spiritual and nebulous and ephemeral and hard to explain and and ineffable, and then you're putting it into a model of FDA approval with placebo-controlled studies, or you're putting into a model of capitalism, and it's not going to fit. You're going to lose. You've got this thing and you're squishing it in there. Like you're going to lose a lot. You're going to lose the shape. You're going to lose the density is going to change. Most people who are paying attention are very worried about the intersection of capitalism and psychedelics, and rightly so. As soon as you get greedy, you cut corners, and things like prepping people or making sure they have integration or screening people, they're going to be corners cut left and right. And the other thing that happens a lot when capitalism gets involved is that there's an unequal distribution of who has access to things. You lose the equity, um, you lose the equality. It becomes, if you have enough money, you can do this, and if you don't, you're out of luck. And we see that a lot already with things not being legal, in the underground community, that if you have, I was just talking to a patient of mine this morning, and she's like, Well, I talked to some people and I looked into this because I'm curious, and I can't afford I just cannot afford like to give somebody $1,000 for a day of their time. I appreciate it's a day of their time. Of course they deserve money, but I can't pay that. And there's a lot of that right now in the underground community where the underground therapists are very, very busy, and so they can kind of set their price with however they want, and they can pick and choose who they treat. And the people who need it most are not necessarily the people who have access to it right now. It's like that a lot, in a capitalist society when it comes to medical advances and things like that too, that it takes a while for everybody who really needs something to get it. And that's a reason, to live somewhere where things are more communally oriented, which is why Jeremy and I are moving. We're moving to Sweden. We just want to let you know. No. Yeah, if anyone can get us a passport anywhere, please get in touch with me.
I will be so happy to have you. Yeah.
Yes. I know a lot of people in this country who are really joking and not so joking about, seeing if they can have a passport elsewhere just in case things get worse, because they have just been slowly getting worse and worse. And as much as no one wants to talk about politics, we are all sort of operating, in terms of our set and setting. There's the set is how you feel about something and what you're expecting, and the setting is sort of your immediate environment. But then the environment one step out is called the matrix that you come from. It's not just, how the room is set up. It's also your culture and your environment and what you're dealing with, outside your room that has a nice cushions and pillows. And, there's no question that my patients are really sort of psychiatrically, psychically, psychologically impacted by what's going on around the entire world and what's going on in our country. And it is sort of seeping just into everything. It's unavoidable.
Yeah. There's a lot going on in the US. It's
Yeah.
from my perspective or our perspective, it's really taking up a lot of attention in the news, and it's
Yeah.
like
R-
both terribly exciting uh and terrifying.
Yeah. And it's also been happening for like 10 years, this like slow turning up the heat, and it's like no one knows when to, I mean, it's almost like a junkie who needs an intervention. And like, have we hit bottom yet? Should somebody say something? And I'm sort of like, I'm starting to like say on Twitter, like we need an intervention. Like we need somebody to step in and be like, okay, enough. You guys need to stop. And no, that's not happening on any level. It's not happening in our country. It's not happening by other countries stepping in and being like, stop already. This is crazy. I
Mm.
mean, uh, you know, if our country were a person, the people who love them would have staged an intervention already. So there's clearly no love and, no tough love, no nothing. I mean, and so nothing stops, and it's terrifying to everybody. It's like watching this train wreck and no one can stop the train from wrecking. So they're all just watching. So yeah, good times. I mean, one thing I joke about is Trump has been very good for my business. As a psychiatrist, like I have job security for everywhere, forever, because people are really anxious and they're depressed and they don't feel well. There's a level of unrest. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I'm gonna stop
Yeah.
talking about that.
So
Let's move on.
coming back to the FDA decision, can you
Yeah,
sort of just walk us through a little bit what happened last year? There was a lot of
yeah.
excitement, and then there was a surprising no. How was that for you personally?
I mean, maybe even maybe some people thought there might be a no, but they didn't think it would be such a hard definitive no with such expensive repercussions. So I mean, the optimists thought there would be a yes. But it was like the hardest possible no, and quite a few things happened. I mean, first of all, there was a really devastating incident that never should have happened but did happen, um, in the phase 2 trials, where there was absolute transgression, like sexual inappropriate, socially inappropriate, absolute boundary violations that should never have happened. And this was in a phase 2 trial at one site. And there were four people run through that one site, and one of them was absolutely not appropriately treated, and the whole situation was dealt with sort of as best as everybody could deal with it at the time. But, in hindsight, I'm sure it could have been dealt with better. So, but the thing is that the FDA was supposed to just be looking at phase 3 data. So in theory, whatever happened in a phase 2 trial shouldn't matter. But it was very egregious and sticky, and you couldn't not look, you couldn't look away. Like, it was important. It was a terrible thing that happened. Everybody agreed it was a terrible thing that happened, but it should not have influenced FDA as much as it did, just in terms of like them looking at the phase 3 data to make an approval or not. So that was one thing. And there were people who felt very strongly that because of this terrible thing that happened during phase 2, with the two clinicians were Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer, and you can certainly Google and learn a lot about it. Um, and uh, it was a complicated dynamic between a couple and a research participant who, after the research was over, ended up living with the couple, getting involved sexually, financially, socially with the couple, living together, moving out, getting in touch with MAPS and saying that this person felt like they had been harmed in the trial. And like, looking back over the entire situation, yes, they were harmed in the trial. Yes, these things should not have happened. Um, and it really was like a sort of a poisoned well situation. Um, I had co-authored a very important paper about discontinuing SSRIs prior to an MDMA experience and how that can have an impact on the experience. And we had analyzed like everybody from phase 1, phase 2, put it all together, pooled the data, and then the journal made us retract the article because we had used uh, either one or two people from this cell of four. And so, I mean, they definitely considered this, that anybody who worked with Donna Dreyer and Richard Jensen, like that, you had to take that data out, and discount it. So, and we were willing to do that, but they wouldn't republish the data. And like, this kind of, baby with the bathwater, like that data is good and it's important. And, um, it, first of all, I never thought I would have a paper retracted in my life, and that really sucked. But anyway, so this whole, it was a scandal, and it didn't die down, and people heard about it, and it was lascivious and bad, and so it had a certain amount of momentum. So the advisory committee of FDA have definitely got all the information about this, so they knew everything that had happened, and I think that really colored a lot of everything else they looked at. And there was also a period of time where Lycos didn't want anybody talking to the press about anything. So there was like a vacuum so that they could just focus on all the salaciousness and nobody could give a rebuttal or reply or explain any of it. So that was bad. But then the FDA had real concerns that they prioritized that we didn't, or MAPS didn't, that we didn't think was very important. But DEA and FDA think it's very important, which was that they want Lycos to measure how much people liked the experience, and like how euphoric they are and how much they might want to take the drug again, because they're very worried about this idea that people are going to like all of a sudden decide that they want to take MDMA all the time because they've had this therapy session. So, and that data was not collected, so it has to be collected. And then also there were, they wanted like more liver studies or more heart studies, even though, all phase 1 showed that like liver, heart, not an issue. We've already done this. There were all sorts of questions and exceptions. And also really one of the biggest issues was the psychotherapy issue, is that MAPS, instead of saying that MDMA is going to be the variable and we're going to use this psychotherapy that everybody knows about and accepts, they made MDMA a variable, but they also introduced a psychotherapy, which is like sort of MAPS's own version of how do you do psychotherapy with MDMA. And it's great. And they spent tons of time making a manual on how exactly to do this therapy. But that ended up being another variable because like they don't even know, like there was no test on whether that therapy works. So I think one of FDA's suggestions is go do the study again, but do it with some therapy that everybody knows how it works, so that you're just looking at the drug. One of the things, there was an article recently that came out, a paper that I think was really important, that is just kind of reminding us, refocusing us. I think Natalie Gukasian is one of the authors. I love her. She's very smart and I think she's going to go places. But this paper was basically like, remember, these things are just a catalyst for therapy. We're like so focused on like, that they're a treatment, but mostly what they do, I mean, the MDMA in particular, mostly what it does is like it helps therapy go deeper. It helps therapy be more effective. It helps you get to the stuff you really need to talk about. And so wherever therapy is effective, MDMA assisted therapy will probably be more effective. And maybe that's really how we should be looking at these studies. It's sort of it's just reminding everybody of like what we're really trying to look at because it's really hard. The placebo control angle is nearly impossible because I mean, many people can assume uh, that they've, oh, I feel something. I don't think I had placebo. And also the clinician working with you is like, they really look like they feel something, like their pupils are dilated and they're smiling and they look like they're glowing. I'm sure this isn't placebo. Like, those things really happen. So why are we doing placebo-controlled studies? Like, who are we kidding? You think, I give you mushrooms and you placebo. You think any of the three of us aren't going to know exactly what's going on? Like, why are we going through this? It's a charade a little bit. And I am the first time I ever experienced MDMA was in 1985, and one of my very first thoughts was that I loved how quiet my head got and how my thoughts, like I could sort of control the speed of my thoughts and I could make them slower or faster. And if I was writing, I could synchronize the speed of my thoughts with what I was writing. And I didn't have to rehearse while I was writing it down. Like I just felt like I had more control over the volume and the frequency of my thoughts. And I remember thinking, what a gift this would be if somebody has schizophrenia and they've just got voices and noise and they just want it to be quiet. And what a gift it would be if it made their head quiet for a few hours. So that's 40 years ago. And this year I'm fundraising for an MDMA schizophrenia trial so that we can see if maybe things get quiet for a few hours. And what is that like for somebody? Or if they don't, okay, great, never mind. I thought it would help. Some people with schizophrenia said it did help them, so we thought we would do the study. But it is it's a bi-coastal study in California and New York, and we're not going to do placebo. We're running these are people with schizophrenia who are very, as in their nature, I would argue that they're pretty suspicious and paranoia is very easy to slip into. So I don't want to bother with placebo. We don't want to. They're just going to run everybody through first with placebo so they can get used to this is your chair. This is the blood pressure cuff. We're going to have this conversation. Next time we're going to give you the medicine, but this time we're just going to go through everything. And so, yes, it's not placebo controlled, but it's also a small pilot study just looking at feasibility. So I've been fundraising for that. It's really near and dear to my heart, this study, and the California side is fully funded and I'm trying to help fund the New York side.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah, I'm thrilled.
So there's a lot more research beyond PTSD with MDMA. There's a
Yeah,
recently published Norwegian study on MDMA for depression. There's the British MDMA for alcoholism
right.
study.
Yeah.
And do you know of any other indications where it's currently being?
Well, eating disorders looks like it's really going to be something. I mean, the early research on couples therapy still holds, and I think there were more recent research done with couples therapy that also shows that if one person has PTSD and you work with a couple with a dyad and both people take MDMA, a lot of healing happens in that context. So, yeah, I think eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorders, one of the things I learned back in the 80s was just like simple phobias. I'm afraid of spiders, and you have like one MDMA assisted therapy session, or maybe there's hypnotherapy involved, but like that phobia is not an issue anymore. So, there are things we don't really think about as like debilitating psychiatric issues, but they still have an impact on people's quality of life. So, any kind of addiction work, I mean, basically, I'll go back to what I said before, which is any diagnosis that is amenable to therapy is going to be even more amenable to the therapy with a catalyst. You're just having like more intensive therapy. So, one of the ways I think about it is like if you've got something that's a big tangle of knots, And like the more you're pulling on it, the tighter it's getting, the worse it's getting. And really what the tangle needs is you have to introduce space into this tangle so you can untie it. How do you introduce that space? This is one way to just give you a little bit of breathing room so you can start to untangle things, you know? And I also think that the metaphor of sort of anesthesia with surgery, it's like root canal or something. Like you can have a root canal and lie there for an hour and be uncomfortable and just white knuckle it. But they could give you something so that, you're perfectly comfortable for the hour that they have to go in there and take this thing out. And, you know, we all have trauma that we have to kind of like sift through and dig down and like figure out where we got hurt and then what happened after that. And like, what's the narrative and what's the story? And it can be really uncomfortable to get down to those, very tender, painful memories. And this is just a way to make it easier to dig and, hurt less.
Mm.
And it doesn't have to be. I mean, MDMA is really a different animal than mushrooms and LSD, and I'm not saying that mushrooms are a catalyst for psychotherapy because I think everything is different. But for sure, that is the situation with MDMA. What I
Mm.
like about mushrooms and LSD and other psychedelics is that this issue of like adding space, so it's untangled. I think that um they what do I want to say here? I'm just having like a little bit of a brain fart in the difference um that you don't necessarily need the talk therapy for the psychedelics. Like you really can just I mean the way they do it in the research a lot of the times is you've got headphones listening to music, you've got eye shades, it's dark, you're just going inside, you're not really talking very much. Um, but the thing that I like about the classical psychedelics is that they get you from a place of cognitive rigidity to a place of cognitive flexibility. They introduce flexibility into the thinking. So like if you have somebody with addiction or with OCD, they're very rigid in how they think. They believe certain things have to be done a certain way in order for things to work. And so you're taking that rigidity and you're just being like, what if it doesn't have to be like this? What if this might work? What if that might, you're here, but I'm just saying, let's just see how it is out here. And, I think you get more of that introduction of cognitive flexibility with the classical psychedelics, that there can be really transformative experiences for people that are hard to put in the words.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think that that we as the psychedelic community can learn from the FDA decision?
Yeah, well, it's hard because both MAPS and Lycos really worked with FDA, hand in hand, going together. Here's what we need to do. Here's what next. This looks good. Do this next. That's great. Keep going. And then you get to the end and they're like, "Oh yeah, actually, you have to do all this other stuff." And it wasn't that FDA said that. It was the advisory committee who hadn't been going hand in hand who said, "What is all this? Why haven't you done this?" And all FDA who'd been working with Lycos had to be like, "Oh yeah, you're right. We should do that too." So uh, it turns out even if you're working with a government agency alongside of them to make sure, look, we've never done this before. We know it's weird. Let's work together, figure out how to do it. Even if you do that, there's no guarantee because as soon as they have an outside advisory committee who hasn't been going step by step by step, they're going to have all kinds of questions, and it's just like you're starting from, it's like you're rebuilding the wheel again. All of a sudden it doesn't matter that you spent 10, 20 years working with this agency. These guys are coming in saying you have to do all this other stuff, and now FDA, of course, they can't be like, "Oh, we told them they didn't have to do that." They just be like, "Oh, our advisory committee said we should have been doing that, so we should." And that was disappointing, I think, also, is that there are people at FDA who really understood the situation, had been in from the beginning, understood the difficulties, were making sure that all these hurdles, were being jumped over. But then with the advisory committee, who are people who don't necessarily know a thing about MDMA, and all of a sudden they are supposed to like get up to speed and make a recommendation, and they weren't up to speed, and they said, "We're not comfortable making this recommendation." Um, it was a really hard day a year ago. It was not a good day for Julie. It was like I was up early. I listened to every word all day long. I was sitting out on my deck. It was a lovely summer day. And, as the day went on, it started out great. FDA came and made their presentation. FDA was like, this is unique. This is different. We had to do X, Y, and Z because we're not dealing with anything we've ever dealt with before. Great. Loved FDA's presentation. Lycos went, gave a great presentation. This is what we're finding. Sounded great. Everything's good. Then the outside people started giving their opinion, and then the advisory committee started giving their opinion. And as the day went on, it was just like getting worse and worse and worse. And by the end of it, it very much, felt like getting punched in the stomach or something. It was just like, it just was, it was good, good, good. And then it was terrible. And so it was a hard day. I mean, uh, I went out. It was sort of like my version of self-harm. I drove about 20 minutes from here and got some food that is very, very unhealthy for me, that I know is unhealthy for me. And I ate it and I was sad. And then I kept half of it for later and I came home. Like, that was as far as it got. That was like my big self-harming moment. But I was really upset about it, and it was, something I had been caring deeply about for 40 years, and then it was over, and and then people wanted to talk about it being over and why it was over and what we could have done differently, and I didn't want to get into all those conversations so much. Like they were, it's hard, hearing everybody sort of, backseat drive what you should have done and what, and a lot of it was not under Maps's control or Lycos's control. If Richard Jensen hadn't done a bunch of things he did, I think that would have helped. I think, if you want to like single-handedly point to a few people who derailed things, certainly Richard Jensen derailed things massively. Nashe Devenot, who took it upon herself to really champion the Richard's victim, she really helped to derail things. And, I get that the victims need somebody to speak for them, but and yes, the victims need somebody to speak for them, of course. Yes. And there are literally millions of people who could benefit from this treatment who now can't get it. So what did we do? Like, we protected a small handful of people who needed protection and could have been protected no matter what, and we've sacrificed millions of people who could benefit from this treatment who now can't get it, who have to wait years. And the truth is, what happens is the people who can afford it, they go to underground practitioners, which is risky. And the people who can't afford it don't get it, and it's not a great outcome. So,
Hmm.
I hope. I don't know. I was going to say that I hope Nishay can sleep at night, but my assumption is that they are perfectly comfortable sleeping at night. So, I was pretty disappointed in the way things went down.
Yeah, I agree with you, and yeah, it's really sad that it wasn't approved. Um, and yet this whole, I mean, the issue with the unethical therapist behavior is can be seen as a one-off. It can also be
Not a
seen
one-off.
as a
Right.
cultural
It's
problem
important.
that
Right.
psychedelic therapy does have.
Absolutely. You cannot pretend it doesn't happen. It does happen. But, there's a saying in America, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? After the bath, that water is dirty and it needs to go. But the baby, you don't throw out, right? So this is a situation where Richard Jensen and all the shamans, in air quotes, who behave badly, they are the bathwater that needs to be thrown out. But that doesn't mean that you stop everybody from having psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We absolutely have an issue that everybody has to talk about always, which is boundary violations and deciding ahead of time what the rules are going to be and sticking with them. And if you decide ahead of time that no one's going to touch you, then that's what happens during the session. And if you decide ahead of time that you're okay with somebody holding your hand, then that's all that happens and no more. And there's really not much of a reason for anybody to ever be touching anybody between their shoulders and their knees. You can squeeze a shoulder, you can squeeze a hand, I mean, but you decide ahead of time if you're going to be touched or not, or if you're going to be held, and maybe you want to be held, or maybe you want to reenact some assault that happened because this time you want to fight back and you didn't last time. And if you agree ahead of time that you want to try to do that, then you agree when you're going to do it and you do it and then you stop when you agree. But it's if you haven't agreed on that stuff ahead of time, you shouldn't be doing any of it. So, there I get that there is, there's a lot of different schools of thought on how to work with psychedelics, and some of them are thousands of years old, and some of them are just a few years old. And, there are people who have been working with people in an altered state, like somebody like Salvador Roque, who's got like very out there ideas of how to behave with somebody. And unfortunately, there have been several practitioners who have been sort of identified as you're problematic, you are transgressing all these boundaries, and they were trained by the same person. They have the same philosophy. This is a Salvador Roque person. So that, is the sort of lineage becomes a little bit suspect. But there's all these other lineages which aren't suspect. And like ayahuasca is a great example, right? There are tribes and peoples who have been integrating this psychedelic brew, this tea, into their culture, and they know how to keep people safe, and there's a whole mechanism of before and after and during that helps to keep people within the boundaries of what's therapeutic, let's say. Um, we are kind of, building the plane while it's flying, or, whatever that metaphor is, where we're just kind of building it as we go along. There's no lineage with MDMA, you know? There are definitely bad actors. There's no question. There's ego, as much as, we all talk about psychedelics as being like ego dissolving, there are a lot of big egos in this space. I'm sure mine included, you know? And so there are bad actors, and the best way to sort of get people behaving well is if they're not hiding. As soon as you drive things underground and people are hiding, you got trouble because no one's keeping an eye on you. You're not modeling healthy behavior for other people to see because nobody's really seeing what's going on. So it's always going to be healthier if things are, open or regulated as opposed to underground and unregulated. But this issue of shamans behaving badly, and I do put shamans in air quote because there are real shamans with real lineage and real training, and they don't behave badly. But these people who decide that they're shamans,
Mm.
who aren't trained, aren't supervised, um, and things can go very badly. I think particularly with something like 5-MeO-DMT, which is the toad excretion, the bufo, the toad medicine, the frog medicine. It's not a frog though, it's a toad. So you like leave your body for a good half hour when you have had a full dose of 5-MeO-DMT. You cannot uh sort of police what happens to your body in a half hour in that situation. So it really depends who you're with when you do these things. So I have a huge file on my computer laptop, um, that every time I hear about one of these situations of transgressions and boundary violations, I add it, I mean, I do what I can when I can, but I also just sort of keep it all in one place because when I hear about something, I sort of check and is this something I know? Is this somebody new? And I really have been for a while. I will continue to encourage somebody that there really needs to be a documentary made about these boundary violations so that we, because there's all these documentaries about how great psychedelics are and how much they'll help you, but we really need like thoughtful, um, you know, education. I don't want to say propaganda, but like we need thoughtful education, and communication around the risks, the behavioral risks, the interpersonal risks of these medicines. They're real, that's they're
Yeah.
not going away.
Yeah. So it brings us into and I noticed that we are already approaching the Q&A, so I just want to give a heads up to everyone yeah, if you have any questions about anything that has been said or anything about MDMA, please write them in the Q&A or raise your hand.
Yeah,
But
always.
before
I'm
that,
also happy to talk about microdosing and those sorts of things, which we didn't really touch on.
yeah. But I'd like to end the interview part on talking a little bit about more about ethics, the future of MDMA, and gatekeeping, training, like how can we implement psychedelic medicine and get rid of the bathwater? What do you think will be
Yeah, I mean that's a is a great question. I mean,
pitfalls of?
specifically with MDMA, it seems like, there has been a MAPS training that was very specific to the MAPS therapy they were using. There will probably be a Lycos training that is more specific to whatever therapy they're going to test, but I do not know exactly what's happening there. What we have here in America is we have a lot of different training companies. Um, and at some point, there will be some governing body that's going to decide, okay, your training program has been around for 20 years, and so we're going to say that it's legitimate, but yours is new and we're not. And, who gets picked and who doesn't, excuse me, is a bit of a question. Um, you know, and I do think it makes sense if you're looking for training that you try to work with one of these older companies because I think it increases the likelihood that the training you're going to pursue will be in the list of things that are considered accredited training. So there's nothing official happening here in the US because it's not legal yet, but if it's legal, there's going to be some sort of governing board that decides you have enough training, you can do this, you need more training, and one of the questions we have is what happens with the underground therapists. There are people who've been doing underground therapy, who've been working with people and performing underground therapy for decades, and maybe they never got training. What happens to them? Do they have to go through a training? And the answer is, they may have to go through something that maybe it's accelerated, but you're going to have to at least take an exam and, prove that you know what you're doing. Um, that's the assumption, but nothing has really been set up. I mean, I don't know how Australia, if they, I believe, they're going to start to have this issue if they don't already, which is that they have to approve a bunch of people and accredit a bunch of people because there's demand that is far outpacing supply in this country and that country. I mean, probably everywhere at this point, demand is outpacing supply. And that's one reason I think why people are microdosing so much also is just that they're taking matters into their own hands. They know it's something they can do without really needing to pay somebody $1,000 to sit with them, you know? Um, and people are not microdosing MDMA. It's much more of a psychedelic thing. So yeah, there is gatekeeping. Lycos is probably going to want to protect their investment. There's going to be like a brand name. God knows what the name's going to be, but there will be like a brand name of midomethamphetamine that'll be called something, silly. Who knows? Um, and that's been very tightly under wraps. What the brand name is, I don't know. Um, There will be gatekeeping because they have poured millions and millions and millions of dollars into getting something FDA approved, and they probably are going to want to have some control over who gets trained and make sure that the people who get trained, it's it's in Lycos's best interest to make sure that whoever is using MDMA is properly trained so that they have good outcome, so that Lycos has a good product with a good outcome. So it's going to be it's to be determined, to be announced. It's very much still all in the works. um there's a lot of new training programs springing up. I don't know if that's the way it is in Europe, but there are more and more training programs springing up here.
Yeah, and well, a lot of it is online as well. So there's a lot of Europeans joining the American training programs as well. And the big question though is what is a training worth at this point? What is
Right.
this
Oh,
certificate
seriously. I
worth?
mean, it's one of the things I felt terrible about a year ago when FDA said no, as I thought about how many people had sunk thousands of dollars and years of their lives either into performing the clinical research, because there was a lot of us, or you know, getting ready to do this work and setting up shop and hoping it's going to get approved, and they've spent the thousands of dollars and now they've got training in something they can't even use. So yeah, one of the many sort of casualties of FDA's decision a year ago is all the people who are ready to be therapists. And what do they do? And I wrote this, I wrote a haiku, which I do sometimes. If I have something really thorny and unwieldy, and I want to try to get it down to a size that I can wrap around in my head, I will write a haiku. And I think what I wrote after FDA approval was something like, "What do we do now? Oh, my amphetamine, we go underground." That's what's happening. Everybody that got their training and sitting around and waiting for the government, and they're like, the government's not saying I can do this, but I'm ready to do it and I'm going to go ahead and do it. And that's really what's happening. There's a demand, there's a huge demand. And so many people are just becoming underground practitioners. Some are trained, some aren't trained. There's no regulation, there's no supervision. It's not a perfect system. But a lot of the regulated above ground things in this country aren't a perfect system either right now. So, um, we live in fascinating times. It's a great time to be a psychiatrist. I say it all the time, but it really is. We have more tools, there's more awareness. Everybody is convinced they have a particular diagnosis. It's a very fun time, I would say, to be a psychiatrist, and what was not that fun for a while.
Mm. Yeah. So I have a bunch more questions, but I also want to let some
Yeah,
of
let's go to
our
Q&A.
audience chime in. So yeah, I want to encourage you all to use the raise hand function. I see one is up there. I will try to like do one question live, and then I'll read one from the chat. So I'll start by um, I was gonna read Mike's question, but since I also saw you raise your hand, I'll give the word to you, Mike, and I have to unmute you. Just one moment, and you can choose if you want to read your question out loud or if you want to speak from your heart. Hang on, there you are.
There we go. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Well, thanks for a very enlightening webinar, Julie.
You're very
So,
welcome.
thank you. So the question is, some people argue that with classical psychedelics, there's a danger of re-traumatization, and it can be rather large, like the risk, when it comes to patients with mental health disorders. Uh, and the reasoning is that this group often may have trauma with little or big T underlying their condition. And classical psychedelics can unleash memories of childhood abuse, neglect, or other unpleasant material and experiences. And the fear response is online. So they say that this can be rather dangerous for that reason. And therefore, MDMA should be the first substance to administer in most cases, as it allows for exploring the psyche, wearing a bulletproof vest in the form of lowered amygdala reactivity. Uh, Furthermore, like classical psychedelics might be used later on for deeper work. So
Yes.
they basically argue that you should use MDMA first, like in most cases, and then use classical psychedelics.
Yeah. So I want
What's
to
your take on this?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I'm really not into everybody using these combinations and giving multiple things at once, or like over the course of one day giving MDMA and then mushrooms and then toad. Like I am a bit of an old-fashioned purist, and I think that you should have one MDMA session and then decide whether you want to have another in a few weeks or a few months, or whether next you want to try mushrooms. But like I do a lot of underground people start with MDMA before they do other things, and I think there's a real intelligence to that. I mean, first of all, for I think for a lot of people, MDMA is a little more like easy to navigate and maybe even a little bit more pleasurable or tolerable than mushrooms or LSD. It's a little bit less of a huge abrupt change in mental status, but I also think and I want to talk about psychosis in a minute, Michael, because I know you're probably interested in all of that too, if I remember you correctly. But
Thanks.
I also think that one of the things MDMA really lets you do is it gives you the lay of the land. It gives you a map. It gives you like a sense of where the easy low-hanging fruit stuff you can grab and where the trickier stuff that is a little harder to get to, where it lives. You may not immediately go to the hardest things, but you see they're there. Um, so I think that can be helpful to do first. And maybe, you get half the work done and you go back and you get the other half of the work done, but then you realize that there's still a couple things you just couldn't quite get to. And so that's when maybe you have mushrooms or you have LSD and you try to get to those things another way. But I think you can do a lot of work, initial sort of plotting the landscape and seeing where the landmines are and where everything is. I think you could do a lot of that work with MDMA. And also, it is, one of the things that's really changing quickly is this issue of if somebody has bipolar disorder, if somebody has schizophrenia, what's safe, what's not safe. And the officially everybody has just been saying, look, if you have any history of psychosis or if you have a family member with a history of psychosis, it may be that these medicines aren't for you. But slowly we're certainly hearing from people who have bipolar disorder, who have tried mushrooms or ayahuasca, or people with schizophrenia who have tried MDMA. And I think at some point, we have to be a little bit brave and a very small pilot study with 6 people or 12 people, and you see if it is tolerated. I mean, obviously, if it turns out it's making people worse, we'll stop. Of course, we'll stop. But nobody will ever do it, and now we'll know. But what if it doesn't make them worse? And what if it actually helps? And we've been spending 40 years saying it's too dangerous for you guys to have these medicines. So at some point, you really have to be brave and do a small pilot study. It's called a feasibility study, and you don't necessarily even need placebo. You just want to make sure it's not going to hurt somebody, right? First, do no harm. But the truth is, there's a lot of people with bipolar disorder or who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder where it may just be trauma reaction. But there are people who can potentially avail themselves of psychedelic assisted therapy. And, I don't want to cut out like huge swaths of patient populations because we're chicken. So, a very important piece, by the way, is sleep. Like anybody who's got a history of mania, um, you've got to sleep 8 hours out of every 24. And that really helps to make sure that you don't get manic. And so something that happens sometimes if you go away for the weekend, you have like ayahuasca for 2 nights and you may not sleep very much for 2 nights. And so if you're bipolar and you have like 2 nights of really terrible sleep, that could be enough to get a hypomanic or a manic episode underway. So the very important thing is make sure you sleep. Maybe not that night, but the next day. Like you've got to sleep, and that can help to decrease the risk of a psychotic episode. But I think in the next few years, we're going to get a better sense of, what the rules are and who absolutely can't and who probably can, but we've been, erring on the side of caution.
Thanks. Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Okay.
So apart from all these somatic risks with MDMA, do you think there's cases where it would be wiser to use classical psychedelics from the start?
Well, certainly, what we didn't talk at all about is just the whole medicine interactions. I mean, there's some people who are on medications where they're not going to feel MDMA, and you really have to look at other options. They don't want to get off their meds, right? So there's plenty of situations where the medicine profile makes it safer for somebody to microdose or macrodose classical psychedelics than it is for them to take MDMA or ayahuasca or ibogaine. Like, there's fewer drug interaction issues with the classical psychedelics than there are with everything else. Also, ketamine, for what it's worth, and God knows we could say all kinds of things good and bad about ketamine, but one thing it does have going for it is that it gets along well with a lot of other medicines in psychiatry. You don't necessarily have to get off all your meds to have ketamine. And, one thing it's worth mentioning, Michael, in terms of like, choosing whether MDMA or classical psychedelics is that some people feel like they should switch their meds around. They're on psychiatric medicines that are going to get in the way, and so they're changing their meds around so that they can have an experience, and that can be a really fraught, risky time. So sometimes when you hear about things that have gone wrong, it's a combination of this person get off their medicines and they had an experience and they were sleep deprived. So you have to sort of dissect it all out. But coming off meds, as I'm sure you all know at this point, it's tricky, it's fraught. If you have absolute, for sure, bipolar one, history of mania and depression, and you come off your meds because you think you have to be off them to do this kind of work, you're already in a much more fragile, labile sort of, precarious position. And that's the case also with really terrible, terrible depressions. And people are on antidepressants and they come off because they want to do the work, but then they're off their meds and they're not doing very well. And let's say they do the work, and let's say they discover things that are really hard to grapple with. Now they're off meds and they're dealing with really hard trauma to process. And if they're not very well supported, that's also going to be a recipe for disaster. So, if you have an established psychiatric history, you really have to find a psychiatrist who's willing to stick with you and work with you while you do this kind of exploration. And lots of psychiatrists are not going to be okay with that. It's not legal, it's risky. What's in it for them? you know? So, I wish more people had more sort of resources
Mm.
to help guide them through this because it's complicated.
Thanks heaps.
So
My
this
pleasure.
there's a nice segue here to a question from Verda in the Q&A section, and that is, what is the duration of serotonin depletion related adverse events following MDMA use, and what intervention can mitigate these effects, particularly in patients with pre-existing depressive disorders?
Yeah. So, one of the things I do whenever I meet somebody new, and I do a very thorough history intake, and I ask them all about their drug history, and I always ask specifically whether they've had MDMA before and whether they had a terrible crash from it or not. Because not everybody gets that crash. And my sense is the people who really do get that crash would probably feel a little better if they had an SSRI on board to just sort of make it easier. So some people, uh, like let's say you take MDMA at like at noon or 12 p.m. and then maybe at like 6 or 7 p.m. Some people will take a little bit of an SSRI at that point with the idea or hopes that it's going to lessen the crash. But part of the reason for the crash is that the enzyme that creates more serotonin is inactivated. And so you really are operating at a bit of a deficit for a while. And some people deficit is not a big deal. Some people deficit is terrible. And so you can take SSRIs during the crash. You can also, some people take 5-HTP, which is basically an amino acid that can help you make more serotonin. And 5-HTP is something that you can buy online here in America. I'm assuming you can get it in Europe. So some people preload with 5-HTP, some people take it after. Um, and the crash is not inevitable. And part of the crash, I think, is that you didn't sleep well, you didn't eat well, you didn't hydrate. There's also sort of whatever kind of psychological things you're processing or not processing from the event. But some people really just crash harder than others. And, aside from SSRIs or 5-HTP, um, I imagine that other people who are listening have other suggestions, but I don't.
A quick comment on that. I think I've heard researchers say that in the MAPS research, no such events have been
Right.
observed.
So
You don't have those.
Ben Sessa specifically looked at mood 2 days out. The Suicide Tuesday is kind of a crash thing, in his alcoholic cohort and saw no such thing. I don't think it's an absolute given that you're going to crash. I really think a lot of it depends on your sort of serotonergic tone, like what your serotonin is like normally. And what you did that night and how you recovered. And did you have MDMA also, or did you have methamphetamine, or did you have mephedrone or methadone? Like, none of us know exactly what we're ingesting these days. And so it does make it a little bit even harder to figure out. But I do know that there's all kinds of protocols that the underground people use before and after to sort of, preload and to help you with the crash. So I just, they're not necessarily, I can't say they're not tried and true because I think there are some underground people who really feel they are tried and true, but they haven't been put through rigorous, clinical testing, I would say.
I see. Thank you. Next question, I'll give the word to Ravad, and just give me a second while I unmute you. There we go.
All right, wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie and Philip, for the very interesting conversation. Although the last two questions were a little bit more clinical and therapeutic, I was interested of your opinions that you shared a little bit when it comes to politics, capitalism, and to which extent that's going to get involved, and the quality of the research and the ethics of it. And I would like to validate a concern that keeps me awake at night, actually, where I find some kind of a dissonance and huge differences between the insight that the patient or the person gain within the psychedelic experience and everyday life living within capitalistic or whatever. Psychologically, you said it's interesting to be a psychiatrist nowadays, and I can't tell you, even here in Sweden, it's not a big difference than what's going on in the US, although you have a big deal of change that took place recently. I wonder if you see any harm at the cultural level, at the societal level, once this is more distributed, whether through legal channels or the underground becomes an economy of in itself.
Yeah, I think, harm at scale feels inevitable to me. Um,
Yeah.
it's not keeping me awake at night. I have lots of things that keep me awake at night, but it feels inevitable that the more people that are exposed, the more you're going to hear crazy stories. We had this story here that honestly I thought would be like more powerful of this, like a guy who had had mushrooms 1 or 2 days prior, who is now in a cockpit of a plane, who becomes convinced that if he can uh, down the plane, he saves humanity, basically, and proceeds to turn off the gas supply to the engine. So uh, that story freaked me out, and I feel like we're going to get more stories like that of people who either are still altered and shouldn't be out and about but they are, or people who have had very intense altering experiences who are having a lot of trouble integrating. The more widespread it is, the less there's going to be guardrails on it, I'm sure. And I think, and this is important, and maybe this is what keeps you up, Rawad, is like the companies that are trying to get these medications approved want as few guardrails as possible because guardrails are expensive, and
Yeah.
they want to show the government that you don't need two therapists, you don't even need one therapist, you don't even need this, you don't need that. So the companies are going to make it seem like it's safe and you don't need guardrails, and greed wise, guardrails are expensive. And so I do think that it is sort of inevitable that as there's sort of a big rollout, I'm using air quotes for those of you listening at home, um, there are going to be these kind of crazy speed bumps where we're gonna hear really terribly frightening stories about things going wrong interpersonally, um, sort of shamans behaving badly and taking over and creating cults. There's
Yeah.
cults of one, there's cults of 12. I've definitely heard about these things happening where psychedelics just kind of make it go even faster. I'm
Yeah.
also really interested in, like, people are becoming delusional just
Yes.
chatting with a chat GPT for 30
Of
days.
course.
What happens when you add psychedelics to that? Or
Yeah.
like this, there's a company now in America that's doing like at-home ketamine, and they've gone from supplying sublingual lozenges to now they're going to actually supply people to inject themselves with ketamine.
Wow.
And I'm really fascinated by this line that we have now crossed, by the way, with needles, because in America now people are injecting themselves with, they get Botox, they take these GLP-1 agonists, the like Wegovy and Ozempic and things like that. So like people are getting more and more comfortable now using needles. I recently heard about gay men injecting their penises with things to keep them hard, or injecting their or actually this is a medical procedure they're getting done, but they're having Botox injected into their internal anal sphincter to make it easier to receive anal sex. So clearly we have kind of crossed the Rubicon with this idea that, like, oh, no needles though. I mean, when I was at Bellevue and I would talk to somebody who was addicted to something, it was sort of like this a place of honor that you either, did everything but, or you had kind of crossed over to injecting. And there's lots of people who use drugs, but they don't use needles. That's where they draw the line. So there's no more line anymore. This injection line is gone now in our culture. So that's just yet another thing that's very concerning. The demographics of who's trying psychedelics is changing like month to month. And like one of the biggest groups is just older Americans who are microdosing. They're looking for longevity, or they understand that there may be some neuroprotection involved with Alzheimer's and things like that. So, the more people using, the more the possibility for sort of crazy mishaps that we knew were going to happen, or stuff that we didn't even think of. It's what we know. What we know we don't know, and what we don't know we don't know. That's where it's gonna get a little tricky. Is that, we're gonna stuff we know and we're gonna see, and then stuff we didn't know that we're gonna start to see.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm so happy to know that that doesn't keep you awake at night.
No, you know what was keeping me awake at night for a while, honestly, was that when we divided the people who had received MDMA into two groups, with like all the MAPS and LICO studies, we took all the people that we had so far and we divided them into two groups. Everybody who got MDMA, we said, did you have to come off your antidepressant SSRIs for the study, or did you not have to come off SSRIs? And the people who had to come off SSRIs before the study had a muted response to MDMA. Psychologically, it was muted. Physiologically, with heart rate and blood pressure, it was muted. And that kept me up at night, because I started thinking, like, what if this means that everybody who's been on an SSRI is not going to be able to have a full MDMA experience now, that they've somehow done something to their brains where they can't experience MDMA fully? And that kept me up at night. And then I thought, well, maybe we just didn't, wait long enough, and we should see, and maybe we could look at parse the data out, and people who, you know, took longer to come off, or took longer between coming off and taking the MDMA. But so that was something that literally was keeping me up at night, Rawad. But if I mean, I could stay up all night worrying about everything that's
I
every
know.
terrible thing that's
Amazing.
happening in the world. But I've gotten really good at boring my brain and thinking about the same boring thing, so that my brain says, all right, never mind, she's thinking about this, let's go to sleep. And so that's really worked for me.
Cool. Thank you very much. Looking forward to see you here in Sweden, actually.
Yeah, I can't wait to get there. Hey, I don't know if people can see the chat, but I did drop like information about the schizophrenia MDMA study at clinicaltrial.govs. And also, if anyone wants to like chip in a tiny bit of money, or knows anybody who might want to chip in a tiny bit of money, what I've decided makes more sense when you're fundraising for a schizophrenia study is not that you go to one or two big corporations or family foundations to fund it, because the paranoia potential is too high, and that if it's crowdfunded and crowdsourced, then the person who has paranoia has to at least grapple with the idea that like lots of people thought this was a good idea, not just one person. So that's why I've decided that I'm just going to really crowdfund this MDMA schizophrenia study.
Thank you, Julie. So last question, and is on your thoughts on ketamine therapy. And I'd just like to, before giving you the word, Julie mentioned that our last webinar was with a fellow American called Lowen Stewart. I don't know if you're familiar with Lowen.
Sure, I know Lowen, absolutely.
He's been pioneering ketamine work in Norway, where it's now getting implemented in the public
Great.
system in a really nice way, using the Montreal model. And he'll be at the
Great.
conference as well.
Oh,
giving
good. I'm glad.
presentation.
He'll be speaking.
Yeah.
Great.
But it's such a tricky situation with
Yeah.
ketamine. There's both
So
huge potential, but also clearly a lot of
yeah.
potential harm.
So I'll say some of the great things about ketamine, and then I'll say some things I don't like. So some of the great things. Number one, it's doing a lot of bushwhacking and getting infrastructure in place, and not just physical infrastructure like clinics and, places that people go to have a ketamine assisted therapy session. It's also creating the infrastructure of the idea that you can have an altered state of mind for an hour and it's going to affect your mood for days afterward. That's relatively new, just this idea that you go somewhere and trip and then feel better. And this idea of neuroplasticity and neuroplastic window. So I feel like ketamine is doing a lot of groundbreaking there. Also, It's legal here, which is great. Sometimes it's affordable, which is great. You don't have to stop your meds to get on it, which is huge in America. We have so many people on psych meds, and if you want to have ibogaine or ayahuasca, you have to really change a lot of your meds around. You don't have to do a thing for ketamine. Maybe you have to, like, miss some morning doses, but you don't have to rearrange their meds. So that's huge. So what I don't love about ketamine is basically the durability is not great. If it helps, it doesn't last very long. For most people, if it helps, it might help for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 2 months, but it doesn't, like, it's not like you get one or two treatments and then you're just done. As opposed to psilocybin or MDMA, where it looks like if you have one or two treatments, you are significantly better for a really long period of time, months or even years. So that's the big issue. I kind of joke, and there are these chips in America called Doritos. Um, and you really can't just have one Dorito. They taste good, but then afterward it kind of tastes gross. You really need another Dorito because, so I kind of call it like the Doritos of the psychedelic world. Like, you're gonna have another. If you respond to ketamine, you're gonna need another, you're gonna need another. And like in a perfect world, you have a treatment or you have two treatments and you don't need treatment anymore, or you're just doing integration. So that's my only complaint with the ketamine, is I'm just not seeing a lot of durability.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're already at the end. I want to end by just again welcoming you to Stockholm in the end of September. I hope to also see some of you there at the Borealis Psychedelic Science Summit. It's really exciting. It's been 7 years since we did a conference
Oh,
last.
really?
Yeah.
You're overdue.
And yeah, it's a really beautiful venue, and there's going to be several events around the conference as well, making it
Great.
worth traveling for.
Good. I can't wait.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Julie. I know
Sure.
you're
Thanks
very
for having
busy,
me.
and I hope you have a great day.
I'm going to go swimming in a lake, so I think it will be just fine.
Oh, that makes me want to ask you
What?
about your what's your current sauna routine? Are you still
Every 2 weeks with the ladies. Love it so much. Yeah. And there's a pond, so, sweat, swim, sweat, swim. It's really nice.
very good? I
Can't wait.
remember talking to you about that several years ago.
Yeah, we have a community sauna, and it used to be that the men and the women alternated, and now the men are just doing once a month, but the women still really love going every 2 weeks, and it's nice, it's like a little group therapy sort of, but just see my friends.
Glad to hear. Yeah,
Yeah, it's great.
enjoy the swim.
All right, so we'll see you
And,
next month. That's soon.
yeah,
Great. All
take
right,
care,
thanks for
everyone.
having me. Stay well, everybody. See you soon.